Bank robbers no longer carry sawn-off shotguns or break open safes. Today's bank robbers don't even leave home to do their dirty work, and it's you who is the target, not the bank.
This has become the most profitable crime on earth.
This is Daylight Robbery. I'm your host, Alex Brooks. In the 1970s and 80s, Australia had a violent armed bank robbery crisis. Today, there's a digital bank robbery crisis. The weapons of choice are stolen emails, fake documents, and exploited trust. The getaway car is almost always a mule bank account, a shady kind of account, sometimes set up with stolen ID. Make no mistake, Australia's digital bank robberies are violent. They steal first home deposits, savings, and entire superannuation and retirement dreams. Our laws haven't kept up with exponentially fast-changing cybercrime, and it's financially ruining Australians. There's no alarms, no sirens, and very little chance of getting your money back. Buying your own home in Australia is already a gamble. If it's not the expensive house prices trying your luck, it could be a pushy real estate agent or an eye-watering mortgage. Most of us don't realise digital bank robbery is also a wild card in Australia's high-stakes home ownership game. Just ask 20-somethings Jessica Greentree and Will Clinton. This couple did what around 2/3 of first home buyers do to buy a home in Australia, which has the second most expensive house prices on the planet. They embraced their frugal side, gave up avocado toast, Jess doesn't like it anyway, and leaned into the bank of mum and dad, the 10th largest bank in Australia. Jess's parents let them live rent-free in an asbestos shed. They didn't need heating. Will and Jess had love to keep each other warm as they saved 100% of their wages and worked side hustles for nearly 2 years. Getting the keys to their first house should have been a day of triumph. Instead, they were financially ruined. The couple had their $50,000 property deposit stolen by a NAB mule bank account in the name of Natasha Swain.
We realised we were scammed when I received an email from the person pretending to be the solicitor saying your money has not gone into our trust account.
Sharks hiding throughout Australia's digital economy had stolen Will and Jess's confidential home buying details and their emails and sent them a fraudulent email redirecting final payment. Criminals sent the email at precisely the right time to trick them. These sharks operate at an industrial scale, executing stings that raise millions at a time.
They had all our details, all of our real estate details, the house we were purchasing. They had me and letterhead on it. And we'd actually been to the solicitor the day before and I'd asked when we'll be paying the deposit and he said we'll be in contact. So then the next day we received that email, so it all lined up really well. So of course we paid it.
The banks say Will and Jess should have verified the account details before transferring any money. And of course they kick themselves for not doing so.
When we'd messaged them saying that it was a fraud, it took them hours and hours, nearly the whole day before they actually did anything.
The law treats the crime as though it all happens in slow motion. It takes months for police to investigate the crime and just as long for banks or authorities to deliver pitiful reimbursement, if any at all. Victims also feel like idiots. Our laws exploit this shame when victims try to seek restitution. Banks don't treat frauds as crime, calling everything a scam and telling victims up front the money is unrecoverable. But fraud is a crime. There are also rules the banks must follow to trace and recover funds through the international banking system, known as a trace and recover. Victims are supposed to feel grateful if the bank recovers even a tiny amount of stolen funds. Yet these funds couldn't be stolen without mule accounts. Mule accounts are a big problem in Australian banks and across the world. Fraud detection company BioCatch says 150,000 mule accounts were identified across Australian banks in 2023. Police told Will and Jess the person who set up the mule account in the name of Natasha Swain can't be found. NAB says it's a perfectly legitimate account, even though that account is now closed and no longer accepts deposits. So what's going on? Well, in Australia, banks don't have to match names and account numbers. This has allowed millions to be scammed from Australians who believe they are transferring money to buy a house, pay a bill, or maybe open a term deposit. Banks spend a small fortune on ads and marketing telling you how secure they are, how much they care to protect you. But banks were first asked to match names and account numbers way back in 2019. Australian banks didn't do it. Most British banks did do it as part of a voluntary system. And today, the United Kingdom has mandatory reimbursement for push frauds like the one Will and Jess experienced. Australian banks rarely reimburse, even when the bank was complicit in allowing a mule account to be set up with stolen identity. Just 2 to 4% of stolen money goes back to victims, according to the regulator ASIC. Some victims complain to the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, known as AFCA, which has thousands of scam cases in a queue. Will and Jess were disgusted to find out AFCA conciliated a reimbursement of just $500 for their $50,000 loss.
We just lost all faith in the Australian banks, I guess.
Yeah.
Just felt betrayed. You think your money's safe in the bank and that's why it's there.
Will and Jess cannot afford to move into their first home. They still live in that asbestos shed and hope that renting out their house will help them financially recover. Because the real kicker is that banks profit from these crimes. Will and Jess's mortgage bank now charge them a higher interest rate on their home loan because they had to change to an investor loan. The interest Will and Jess will pay on their $50,000 digital bank robbery at current mortgage interest rates means this crime will cost them an extra $123,000 in interest over the next 20 years. And that's on top of the $1 million home loan they already have. Former New South Wales Police and ASIO investigator Dan Halpin says Australian laws and police are failing victims of cybercrime.
There's no criminal investigation possible, and then there's no civil investigation possible. And that all comes back to the system in Australia, which is completely broken.
Most of Australia's legal protections against fraud were held in the laws governing cheques. Since no one uses cheques to buy property anymore, real estate scams and frauds are rife. Law Cover told me at least 40 cases of property-related cybercrime happen each year just in the state of New South Wales. A New South Wales home buyer defrauded in 2021 told me victims regularly knock on his door and message him through social media asking for his help. He can't reveal his identity because he recovered his losses by suing civilly, which can cost tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. And once a fraud victim is reimbursed through civil law, it's usually subject to confidentiality rules. Another way to sweep the problem under the carpet. In Western Australia, a woman lost more than $732,000 buying a house, and in South Australia, another lost $813,000. Under Australia's e-payments code, financial crime victims authorise their own loss if they transfer money online. And now that branches effectively do online money transfers, banks are changing the terms and conditions of their accounts and apps to ensure victims keep authorising their own loss. When it comes to rape, we no longer blame the victim. When it comes to financial crime, Australian law firmly blames the victim, and it's causing untold harm.
I am aware of some situations where victims are suffering massive depression, and I've even heard of cases where victims have committed suicide.
Banks profit by charging interest on the losses from these crimes. Russian-born first home buyer Ilya Fomin understands this only too well.
Really, for bank, it is profitable to have me scam.
Ilya bought his first home in Sydney for $390,000 just before Christmas in 2023. He lost a whopping $282,000 to a CommBank Mule account set up in its Martin Place head office branch. Now, Ilya is no dummy. He's a geophysicist who did due diligence on his property purchase right down to testing the soil types around the apartment. Ilya has lived in Switzerland, where the banks were different to Australia, and very different again from Russia. So when he received a strange email that made Ilya worry he might lose his apartment deposit, he went into NAB, who gave him the mortgage, and asked what he should do. The teller asked him a few strange questions, though refused to check the validity of that CommBank Mule account. This led Ilya to believe he should do the fateful transfer, which of course he also kicks himself for. Ilya, like Will and Jess, fell victim to a financial crime that he had to take the blame for, even though he did the transfer in a branch which isn't technically subject to that e-payments code. Banks are shifting all liability for fraud to customers. But customers have even less ability to spot a mule account than a bank does. But Ilya has even more suspicions about why the bank does this. He firmly believes it's to make money out of him. Instead of his planned $70,000 mortgage, Ilya now owes more than $300,000 on his mortgage to NAB. His bank is profiting by nearly $2,000 a month, charging interest on the loss their bank enabled. Like Will and Jess, he went to AFCA to complain about what happened. AFCA conciliated only a token reimbursement, which Ilya has rejected. He is appealing to the Ombudsman, but 10 months later has no refund. He is paying a monthly mortgage 4 times larger than he intended.
I call it the worst Monday of my entire life. What I felt, I got goosebumps just talking about it. My whole world I got no words. It was horrible. Horrible.
That's Levin Salaberry. He had $91,650 stolen trying to transfer his property deposit money in a CommBank branch just 2 weeks after Will and Jess in 2023.
I went up and ran into the bank in a state of panic, and they were panicking for me. And that's when they disclosed at the Bankstown branch that, don't worry, it's another Commonwealth account opened up at Rockdale. So when I finished with them, I just raced over to Rockdale, and it's hard to explain in the state of mind that I was in. I thought surely we can do something and I'll be fine, and it's a painful time.
Nothing could be done. The digital bank robbery gangs transfer the money sometimes within minutes of it hitting the Mule bank account. Levin went straight to the police at Rockdale to report the crime. I used Freedom of Information laws to obtain Levin's police report. Those records confirmed the CommBank account that stole Levin's money not only received it, but had been set up with a stolen identity. I investigated the account name Levin's bank teller transferred to, F. Ahmed Services, and found it's a sham $100 company set up explicitly to defraud people. This F. Ahmed Services company was registered by director Feroz Ahmed, born in 1983 in Bangladesh, from a residential apartment address in Market Street, Rockdale. Now, police couldn't charge this company director with any crime, and that's because Feroz Ahmed claimed his identity had been stolen. And this is the problem with mule accounts. Banks know these accounts are not legitimate, but mules, even when they take a cut of the stolen money, claim their identity was stolen and had no idea it had even been set up. This makes it impossible for police to charge mules with any crime under Australian laws. We'll explain more about company mule accounts in coming episodes when you'll learn Hassan Mehdi's amazing tale of being the mule in $1 million sting. Australia's financial guardrails have crumbled, leaving bank customers defenceless against tech-savvy criminals who are getting rich quick. Investigators like Ken Gamble, who helped the Australian Federal Police take down these gangs, say Aussies have a bullseye on their bank accounts.
I've had scammers that we've arrested overseas say to me that we've been targeting Australia because we get the best results out of Australia than any other country in the world.
We're also really trusting. We trust that governments and banks have our backs and will protect us. Dan says cyber fraud is proliferating in Australia and across the world. How much easier is it to scam than it is to rob a bank these days?
So much easier. And we're also seeing a lot of large criminal syndicates who are traditionally in drug exportation or importation into Australia. They're now shifting to cybercrime because it's so much easier. The chances of getting caught are minimal, but the reward is so much higher.
Ken investigated an artificial intelligence scam that raised more than $5 million in early 2024 from unsuspecting Australians.
We traced that some of the victims put money into an Australian bank account in a company account that had been set up by a Lebanese politician whose father was a very heavy supporter and sympathiser of Hamas and Hezbollah. This is a direct connection to potential terrorist supporters who have a bank account which is receiving money in a big scam.
These high-tech heists are clearly a problem, and not just because the money funds war or terrorism. As we produce this episode, the federal government has introduced scam prevention laws into Parliament.
What we're seeing with the banks and the new legislation is what I see as buck passing from the government. So the government is extremely liable through inaction. That includes both within Australia by pursuing or providing support to victims, but also the lack of pursuit of those offenders overseas.
Victims are financially ruined and traumatised by waiting months, often years, to find out whether they will get any justice. And these crimes are every bit as traumatic as those violent armed bank robberies were in the 1970s and 1980s. Under the ASIC Act, banks have a legal duty to provide their services with due care and skill. The Banking Code also demands banks be diligent and prudent, yet AFCA rarely finds in favour of victims in these messy cyber fraud cases, even when mule accounts are used. The e-payments code seems to speak the loudest, as do the banks who actually fund AFCA. Blaming victims makes it really easy to keep the cybercrime problem hidden from view. The World Economic Forum says cybercrime is the world's third largest economy after the US and China. And how big will Australia's economy be if we continue to allow these crimes to flourish? Well, at least 0.1% of Australia's economic GDP was reported lost to fraud and scams during 2023. It's also killing our under-resourced state police who don't have the training or time to investigate these complex, messy cases. Most victims are too embarrassed to come forward with a report. And can you blame them? Next time on Daylight Robbery, we meet Harriet Spring. She sold her elderly mother's oceanfront home and lost a massive $1.6 million in a digital bank robbery. We dig into stories from Ken Gamble and Dan Halpin, the real-life private eyes tracking foreign crime syndicates across the globe. They explain how digital bank robberies in Australia have chilling ties with global terrorism.